I'm Dr. Lindsay Pennington, one of 3 editors-in-chief of IJLCD, and I work with Dr. Paul Conroy and Dr. Joanne McClelland. Can we move the next slide on, please? And I work with 3 associate editors also. Next slide, please, Rebecca. Dr. Silke Schmidt, Dr. Mark Jays, and Dr. Jackie McRae, who's recently joined us after the departure of Dr. Natalie Munro. We're delighted to be able to host this session today with RCSLT. Next slide, please. In 2021, we lost Professor James Law, one of the great researchers in speech and language therapy, and indeed speech and language development. The editorial team wanted to mark James's contribution to the field, and we've chosen to dedicate this year's annual lecture to James and his work. We're thrilled to be able to be joined today by 2 close friends and colleagues of James, Professor Sheena Riley from Griffith University in Queensland, Australia, and Professor Christina McKean from Newcastle University, UK. And they're going to be presenting on New Horizons in Developmental Language Disorder, a topic close to James's heart. In a break with tradition, we're also going to have an introduction to this annual lecture given by Professor Julie Dockrell, another close colleague of James, who will talk about the breadth of his work and its impact. The session will be closed by Dr. Julie Morris, Head of Education, Communication and Language Sciences at Newcastle University, where James worked for over a decade. We're delighted to be joined by some of the members of James's family, and others will be watching the recording later, which will also be made available to RCSLT members, as indeed will the slides from Christina and Sheena. Before we start the session though, I'd just like to announce some housekeeping items. If you have any technical difficulties, please raise these in the chat function in the presentation. And please note down questions for Christina and Sheena as we go along in the Q&A. There'll be time for questions at the end of their session. And then what I'd like to do now, before we go into the main session, is announce the Editor's Prize. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. This year, the prize goes to Paula Cronin and Rebecca Addo for their paper on interactions with youth justice and associated costs for young people with speech, language and communication needs. The paper shows the breadth and scope of the journal, and I'm sure it will be read widely and used by clinicians, policymakers and researchers. So congratulations to Paula and Rebecca. And now we'd like to get into the main part of the session. So I'm going to introduce and hand over to Professor Julie Dockrell. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you can all hear me and see my screen. First of all, I want to thank you for giving me the honor to say a few words about James. James and I worked together for over 20 years, so I regarded him as both a colleague and a friend. I chose this picture of James because for me, this epitomizes who he was. It's his warmth and his empathy with actually people of all ages, but particularly with children. So I want to talk about a couple of things that I think James contributed and what he's left us with. First of all, I want to talk about James as the academic, where his work exceeds what you would expect from most people. And I think to some extent that was recognized by his membership of the ref panel for this last round here. So James has a strong impact, which is regarded as important in research circles. So he's highly cited. His most highly cited paper is the one looking at modeling developmental language difficulties. And I think what is what's important about this is it captures James's breadth of thinking and looking at how language interacts with a range of factors and impacts on a range of different outcomes. His reach is international. There isn't really anywhere you can go in the world where people don't know about James Law or haven't had James speak before you go and speak. So across the world, his work has been recognized, but also important, and this is, I think, something unique about the way James has worked, is reach goes across disciplines. So this is an indication of the different areas of research in which James's work has been published. So it goes from linguistics to clinical neurology to psychiatry to education. But as anybody who knows James well will understand, actually research academia wasn't a real focus. He was an innovator. He made changes. So one of the important things that he's pushed is working towards recognizing the impact of social disadvantage on children's language and language development. He's looked at reading and the ways in which reading with preschool children boosts language by as much as 8 months. And I love his comments about it's really important that dads should read with children too. He worked with me on the development of the communicating supported classrooms tool, something that's freely available for practitioners, teachers, speech and language therapists to use to profile the language learning environments in the settings in which they work. And he was instrumental in the What Works database, which is housed now at ICANN, but has had a long-term impact in a site that's used by professionals across the world, but also across disciplines, speech and language therapy and education, educational psychologists. So strong academic, innovator in what he did, but also I'd say an empowering critic of work. And that's really important because it means it's had wider impact. So he's had a strong impact on practice, and that spans education, speech and language therapy. And there's often been a disjuncture there, and James crossed that boundary seamlessly. He highlighted something which he calls universal targeted. That means we have red flags for areas where children might have language challenges, and this is where you need to embed within educational practice universal approaches to supporting speech and language. No question was too small for James. Broad range of issues from dosage, how much is necessary for an intervention to be effective, and the fact that actually we don't have a lot of data that looks at that, to the cost effectiveness of the interventions that we run for children generally. And also, quite interestingly, I think, no data was too small to be interrogated. He used a range of data sources. So he used longitudinal cohorts. He did systematic reviews. He was involved in experimental studies. He supported observation work. He used questionnaires. He was involved with interviews. So James's breadth is about the issues he tackled, but also in the ways he used different research methods to try and unpick what was happening. James was one of those rare academics who I would say was open and supportive. He was an easygoing colleague. He always had time to listen and talk to you, often in a convivial context, restaurant, kitchen, coffee shop, didn't matter where you talked about things. He was inclusive, so he included students at all levels and staff and academics at all levels. And often in these conversations, there was a word about how his family was doing and the latest excursion that they'd been involved with. It's hard to say exactly what we miss as far as James. Certainly I'm missing him at the moment as I write up a report for a project he was involved with. But I think I'd like to capture this in terms of 4 main points. That's his constructive engagement about research questions and its impact. His good humor, he always managed to stay calm, balanced, positive, whatever the tragedy or the dilemma that was going on. He was balanced, he empowered his colleagues, And what's, I suppose, really important is that his legacy lives on. There were 6 publications that I found in 2022, which James was involved with his colleagues, with his students, and hopefully for all of us, but particularly I think for me, as I look at our new data, is his mindset, which was open and inquisitive, and that, you know, you always had to ask why and how might we find out a little bit more. So I'd like to end my few minutes by just saying thank you, James.
Thank you, Julie. We'd now like to hand over the main session to Professor Sheena Riley and Professor Christina McKean. And I think it's Christina up first.
I think it might be me up first. Lindsay.
Well, welcome, Sheena. Thank you very much. Over to you. Thank you.
No problem. I'll just get my slides to start. They seem to have jumped forward a little bit, so let's go back to the beginning. Apologies, everyone. Not a good start, is it? I'll say good morning again and start all over again. Thank you to the college and to the journal for asking me to be part of this presentation and tribute to James today. I'm truly honoured that I'm able to do that, to talk about my good friend and colleague James, and I'm delighted that some of James's family will be present or were able to listen back to this and hear about how wonderful he was. James travelled to Australia a number of times to visit our research teams, and most recently he travelled to Griffith University on the Gold Coast, where my campus is located, and the traditional custodians of the land on which Griffith is located are the Yunganba Kumbamberi people, and I would just like, in the spirit of reconciliation, to pay my respects to First Nations peoples in Australia, given I'm going to mention a few things about them. Being given the brief of speaking about the legacy of James came with a great deal of responsibility. As Julie just indicated, his legacy is enormous, and the breadth of the research that he was across was really quite considerable. So I've tried to limit myself to 3 points today. I'm proud that I've got it down to 3 points, and I want to focus on why population health, what have we learned, before moving on to some things that I think might move us forward in the spirit of which James would want us to move forward. I think these very much influence James's thinking, and certainly my thinking. They reflect his passion for population health and its relevance to how language develops, what can go wrong, and then what we can do about it, which Christina is going to cover off on later. Before I do that, I just want to make a few points about population health and why we were so passionate and remain passionate about population health and its relevance to children's language development. And it is largely because of the social determinants of health, that is where you live, you work, you play, that this has a much greater impact on an individual's quality and length of life than many other things. The population health framework recognises the complexity of the issues that face the health of our communities. And it provides us with a framework and a broad perspective to identify and address factors that affect health and well-being. 4 key points that I want to make that I know James was passionate about. The first being about socioeconomic position, health and well-being. Many of you will be aware of Marmot's writing. He wrote this amazing piece in 2010 about the relationship between health and education and socioeconomic position. And I just draw your attention to this quote from his writing. And most importantly, the last sentence here, the two are linked. The more favoured people are, socially and economically, the better their health. Marmot followed up in 2020 with another really interesting piece. And in this, he lamented really that inequalities had increased and there had been a decline in people's health. James was really passionate about the writings of Marmot and how we applied this to our thinking for child language. The second point was care injustice. This is the perverse relationship between healthcare utilisation and population needs. It's perverse because those who most need care are least likely to receive it, and those who least need services tend to use them more. And there are real drivers behind why people who most need care are least likely to receive it. And some of these are here on the slide for you to see. And I'm going to come back to some of these when I get to the second part of the talk today about some of the learnings that we've had from longitudinal studies and epidemiological studies. The third point is inequality and inequity. And when I walked down the corridor here at Newcastle University this morning, I saw this cartoon on at least one door and another version of a similar cartoon. We really need to keep these concepts at the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about approaches to children with language difficulties and whether we're actually reaching all of the population. They're really concepts about sameness and fairness, and I'm going to come back to this later as well. The fourth point is really about what the life course approach to health and development and language development, as I'm going to go on to talk about, really why it's really important and what the fundamental principles here are. First of all, that early exposure to risk and preventative factors can have long-term effects. Key life stages or transitions present particular opportunities for positive change. And the early years, in the words of Shonkoff and Phillips, are a sturdy or fragile stage on which subsequent development is constructed. I wish I'd written those words. They're really rather special words. And the final point here is the social context of individual interactions and experiences determine the degree to which individuals can develop their abilities and realise their potentials. James was really interested in models and how we use models to understand language development and the complex influences on language development. And in the book that we were editing just before he died, entitled Language Development, Individual Differences in a Social Context, he wrote particularly about Bronfenbrenner's model, ecological model. And I just want to spend a few minutes going through this because, again, it underpins some of the things that I'm going to talk about. We start with the child at the centre of the model. And I come back to those words of Shonkoff and Phillips about the child being on a sturdy or a fragile stage on which subsequent development is constructed. Around the child is the first stages or first set of influences. It's the child's smallest and most immediate environment in which they live. The major influence being, of course, the relationships that they have with their caregivers. These relationships are also affected by the conditions in which the child lives, the neighbourhood, the care derived outside the home, relationships between these microsystems, home and school, peer group and family, family and neighbourhood are all very important influences on the child. As we build out the layers, we can see that there is a broader community environment that becomes important. The parent or caregiver's work, the child's school, and other relevant community settings which may in turn be influenced by broader social, cultural and policy conditions which are depicted in this final layer here. Now, although these layers are further from the child, the trends and transitions here include a range of social and historical shifts and contexts that can have lifelong and intergenerational impacts. And these are things that we definitely need to be thinking about. We see this, for example, in our First Nations children in Australia, where there is historical and intergenerational trauma and systemic racism that has a long-term effect on these children. None of these relationships are static. They interact constantly. There are multiple factors, multiple dimensions, and they interact dynamically and transact. I didn't actually put the final layer of Bronfenbrenner's circle, which depicts the life course, on the slide, and I've chosen to just spread it out here because there are some things I want to demonstrate in future slides around some of the research that's been done. Because I think the life course is really important here, and it is something that I really want to call out. I've also just put this little cartoon up there to remind us that there is this newish field of epigenetics, newish in terms of language development anyway, and this is really about how some of these environmental factors, particularly in the early years, might influence gene expression. That's not a topic for today, it's a whole different lecture, but it does need to be thought about in the context of intervention in particular. So like other developmental domains, language development is shaped by a range of biological, social and environmental factors. It's an emergent property of living systems. It's complex, it's not linear, it's multi-directional. It's sensitive to the timing and the social structure of environmental exposures. And it's subject to a range of factors that enable and can constrain our developmental pathway. In finishing this first section, I just want to ask, what is a public health problem? And according to Schoolworth and Daly, a public health problem is one that places a large burden on society. The burden must be unfairly distributed, and there's evidence that early preventative strategies can substantially reduce this burden. So what have we learned on this journey that we've been on over the last 10 to 15 years? James and I wrote this paper with Pam Snow back in 2013. And in this paper, we were really trying to think about a new direction for the profession and thinking about it within a population health context. We were acutely aware that the nature of communication disabilities was changing. The impact of the social gradient on early communication and language development was increasing. And we still had a long way to go to understand how factors interact and impact across the life course. And we wanted to ask a number of questions around who was accessing services, were there factors that drove this access? How different were population or community samples from the cohort that actually do attend clinics? And what did this mean for identification, prevention, and intervention? We certainly didn't answer all those questions, but we were pretty good at posing questions. The first issue I want to deal with here is the clinic cohort representative of the population of children who have language challenges? Sometimes I'm going to be talking about low language because some of the work that I'm going to present was done prior to the consensus around DLD. So I just want to be clear about that. Carla McGregor summarised this beautifully in a paper that she published last year called How We Fail Children with DLD. And one of her main findings was that the proportion of children who were deemed eligible for clinical services because of DLD fell well short of estimates based on what we think the prevalence might be in a community or population study. Now, there may be a number of reasons for that, but I don't think those reasons collectively can really explain the differential between the fact that children with poor language are underrepresented in our services And estimates from a range of different studies would suggest that between 39 and 45% of children with poor language in a community cohort are actually known to speech and language therapy services. Carla pointed out, and this data comes from a number of different studies, that there are inequities that drive and determine who gets to be seen in clinics. And these are based on geographic location, postcode lottery, minority status, gender, and definitely socioeconomic status. We also know that the rate of associated problems may drive someone to clinic. So having an associated behaviour problem or a speech problem, a fluency problem, for example. What does this mean for research and practice? Well, it probably means that less than 50% of the population may not be receiving services. And as I've said, there's different ways to interpret that data. It means that if we're setting up a study based on clinical attendees, those attendees might only represent a proportion of all the children with language problems. And the patterns that we observe in children in the general population might not be reflective of those seen in specialist clinics. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting we shouldn't do clinical studies. Of course we should, and they have a real role. This is really about how we interpret some of the data and generalise the data. One of the questions we posed in the paper was our services where they were most needed. And we didn't have this data when we wrote that paper, but it was work that we went on to do afterwards. Now, most of this work has happened in Australia, and I don't know how generalised it can be, but I know that there's some similar work being done in the US. And what we found is that there was a real mismatch between language and communication vulnerability in the preschool years and service location. So it says care and justice. The most vulnerable children were in areas with fewest services, and those areas tended to have an underrepresentation of publicly available services. Two of the studies mapped needs and services by socioeconomic status, and the areas with the greatest socioeconomic disadvantage had the highest language and communication vulnerabilities and the fewest services. So geographical location is obviously a really important issue here. I now want to go on to talk about some of the early influences on language development. And I think there's some really exciting research emerging in this area that is going to inform future surveillance and interventions. And I want to talk about this in three groups. First of all, studies that are a little bit older now, but very important, that look at latent effects. This refers to an early exposure and what that means for later points in the life course. Then I want to move on some outcomes from research looking at pathways, so experiences that set people on certain trajectories and what influences those trajectories, before moving on to talk about cumulative effects. So the experiences that might accumulate over a period of time during childhood, and that might include latent and pathway effects. So let's start with some of this early work, very important work that James was instrumental in being involved in. And it was work that really asked a fundamental question: does early language proficiency influence the longer term outcomes? And some of the earliest work here was were the studies by Beachman and Schoon, and of course Bruce Tomlin. And what we found here was that yes, of course, early language proficiency or poor early language had longer term effects. And here I've just summarised the findings from a whole load of different studies. So impacts on social emotional well-being, literacy and academic attainment, future health literacy, mental health, employment, social anxiety and isolation. There was then a body of work that was undertaken which really looked at what are the early factors that influence later outcomes. And again, a number of studies have contributed to this body of work. I've grouped them here according to some child factors, some family factors, and environmental factors. These vary a little bit depending on which studies you look at and what baseline factors some of these studies have actually measured. But these core factors that I've summarised here on the slide, there seems to be very general and strong agreement that these are important factors. Child factors, neurobiological risks, birth order, and early communication and language development. Family, having a family history of speech and language, maternal vocab, education and mental health status, and of course, socioeconomic disadvantage. These have a strong influence on later language outcomes. The next set of research findings that I want to spend a few moments on is pathways. Does language ability vary? Language in pathways in the early years, 0 to 4, tends to be fairly unstable, but becomes more stable over those early years, so that by 4, children's language pathways appear to be much more stable. The early instability in those preschool years has hindered some of our targeting and ability to really get in with some early intervention approaches. Some of that work was done before we actually understood what might have been happening in these early years. But what we do know is that from 4 years, these trajectories are much more stable, although there may well be some fluctuating profiles apparent in some smaller groups. But we can be fairly confident that children by 4 who have low language will tend to remain with low language. But we also need to be alert to a small group of children in whom language problems could emerge later in school years. So there's a small group of children in there whose problems may not become apparent later. The second part of the pathways work was considering what factors might be associated with language trajectories 7 years. And there's a variety of different studies being published on this, and I'm going to just choose to highlight the work by Christina, who identified 3 main groups: a stable group, a low decreasing group, and a low improving group amongst these trajectories. What was really interesting here is the factors that were associated with these groups. So the low decreasing group tended to be associated with more biological risks: low birth weight, socio-emotional problems, lower family literacy, and learning disabilities. Whereas the low improving group tended to be associated with environmental risks, coming from a family with English as a second language, social disadvantage, fewer books in the children's homes. I now want to move on to talk about trajectories and cumulative risk. I'm not going to talk about trajectories, I'm talking about cumulative risk. Does the number and combination of risks influence language outcome? I'm going to draw on 2 studies. The first that Trishidi published just recently, work from using the Early Language in Victoria study. And the second study, really fascinating work by Kate Taylor and colleagues using data from the longitudinal study of Australian children. In Trisha's paper, she looked at a range of early life factors, 16 risk factors, measured across the child's early life, and then the risk of having low language at 7 years. The overwhelming finding was as the number of risks increased and accumulated, we're talking about 4, 5 and 6 plus risks here, so did the likelihood of having low language. In fact, it increased really dramatically from 5 to 17 times more likely to have poor language at 7 years. And this table here just summarises the risks down here, the number of risks, the total number of children, the number with low language, and the risk ratios. And I just draw your attention to the bottom line here that I've highlighted, where children with 6 or more risks were 17 times more likely to have poor language at 7 years of age. Trish then started to look at did some latent class analysis and identified 4 different classes or groups within this subset of children. And I won't talk through them all, they're listed here on the slide. But what I want to do is just highlight a few interesting factors about the classes and the profiles that are demonstrated here on the slide. In comparison to the developmentally enabled or well-resourced group, that's the first group here, groups 2, 3 and 4 consistently had more males and lower scores for parent-child interactions and low maternal education. Groups 2 and 3 had fewer books in the home, and the children tended to have lower language scores also at 4 years of age. And each of these groups was distinguished by a unique and defining feature. Group 2, the developmentally vulnerable group, had low use of early gestures, vocabulary, and non-verbal cognition, whereas Group 3 tended to have greater social disadvantage, and Group 4, as indicated by the title, more mothers presented with mental health problems. I now want to move to the work done by Kate Taylor on receptive vocabulary. Kate also explored 16 risk factors for receptive vocabulary and looked at receptive vocabulary across 3 points, 4, 6 and 8 years in the longitudinal study of Australian children. A larger sample than the sample in ELS, and Kate identified 6 latent classes amongst her sample, and these corresponded to different patterns of exposures. So on this slide, I've summarised the classes and the groups as Kate and her colleagues have described them, and the number of risks here. I won't talk through each of them, I'll let you have a look at them, but I'll just pick out a couple. For example, here, the overwhelmed group, associated with a really high number of risks, 6.1. This group tended to have the highest rate of Indigenous status amongst its families. They were more likely to be of lower maternal, more likely to have mums who were more poorly educated, higher levels of disadvantage, low book reading, and the highest rate of maternal mental health distress in that third group. And I'll just comment on the last group here, which is the resource poor group, associated with 4.7 risks. They were more likely to be of non-English speaking background, and that was combined with an increased likelihood of maternal psychological distress, low parenting consistency, low income. Families here were more likely to be on health care cards, for example, and to live in neighbourhoods with greater disadvantage. This column here that's just appeared shows the gap in receptive vocabulary in months at 5 years. So what we can see here is that our resource poor group down here had a gap of 26 months, and our overwhelmed group here had a gap of 20 months. Smaller gaps for the other 3 groups. Kate and her colleagues then saw these children, and their vocabulary was measured 4 years later. And what this final column shows you is what the gap in receptive vocabulary was 4 years later. The working poor pretty much remained the same. The group with low human capital showed little variation, but there was quite considerable change in the resource poor group here, and the overwhelmed group here. So some really interesting findings here about what might be changing in terms of receptive vocabulary here. So I think I want to summarise this section just by saying I think there's been some really major shifts in our research effort. We've moved from looking at latent effects into this very exciting new area of thinking about how risks might accumulate over a period of time, what that might mean for language development, the factors that influence it, and the sorts of trajectories and risks that we might be interested in, but really importantly, what it means for our intervention approaches. So I just want to go back to the question that I posed earlier, but this time change it slightly and ask, is DLD a public health problem? First, it must place a huge burden on society. Yes, I think our research shows it does. The burden must be distributed unfairly. Yes, I think we have increasing evidence that that is the case. And the final point, evidence that early preventative strategies can substantially reduce the burden, I'm going to leave to Christina to answer in the second half of the presentation. So how do we move forward? I want to just focus on 5 critical research gaps that I think we need to close. And in addressing these, I recognise that there are much broader policy and training issues associated with these. So it's not as simple as just saying fix this, but that's another talk. The first one being the lack of investment and the lack of awareness around developmental language difficulties, disorders. In this country, there has been a huge effort to address both of these, and I know there are efforts around the world to do this. People like Dorothy, Carla McGregor, and the Cost Action Working Group are all working on this, but somehow we do need to move this forward even further. But I take my hat off to the people who have been really working on this big gap. The second gap, I think, is understanding more about the biological contribution. We're really at the early stages here. And I just want to highlight this recent systematic review that Hayley Mountford published, where she really pointed to the importance of consistent phenotyping. And by that, I mean, you know, talking the same language about DLD, the inclusion criteria, and the way we measure it for studies. If we don't get that right, it's going to be very difficult to understand the gene environment interactions and how these might contribute to phenotypic variations and what that might mean also for intervention. And Hayley found in her review that there was considerable variation. The second gap is the social gradient. There's so much more we need to do to understand why it's so marked, what it means for language intervention, how interventions work, for whom and under what circumstances. We have to acknowledge the structural inequalities when we design interventions and evaluate outcomes, and recognise that subpopulations of children might have service needs that span health, education and social services. And as Julie said in her opening remarks about James, this was something James really got, and he moved seamlessly across these different areas. The fourth gap, I think, is more work on understanding groups and pathways. So some of the information I've presented to you today is the sort of beginning of that work. There's no doubt that the developmentally enabled group seem to do much better. And as Heckman says, skill begets skill. I think the risk accumulation work is really worthy of consideration. And it really raises for me the fact that different policy responses might be required to match our interventions. But a lot of this work really points to the fact that many of these small early gaps translate into much major gaps later in life. And that brings me to my final gap, which is about understanding the push and pull factors. Single risk factors certainly underestimate the extent to which developmental circumstances shape children's life. And I just love Kate Taylor's quote in one of her recent papers, like wolves, risk factors hunt in packs. So how do we understand how these risks cluster together, accumulate, and what that means for protective, when there are protective factors in family as well. For developmental surveillance, I think there's a really important learning here, and that is about considering multiple risk factors, factors that cluster, and the cumulative effect of these across the early life. We have everything in place to be able to do this. We just might need to do some of it a little bit differently. And this brings me to something that James and I and many other colleagues, in particular Melissa Waite, discussed a number of times. Is it time for a risk matrix for understanding developmental language disorders? You know, should we have some sort of matrix that allows us to think about the number of risks or the cluster of risks, and then the impact or potential consequence of how those risks might cluster together and what that might mean? I think it's probably more complex than the 2x2 matrix that I've drawn out there. So it was beyond my abilities to depict that in a cube, but my rotating cube is really just a way of highlighting that I think we might need to think about this on a multidimensional scale. I think the future is dependent on data sharing and replication across sectors, across countries, to understand how children and families interact with services over time. I don't just mean in the traditional ways of doing some of these studies. And I think evaluation of approaches across local government areas or whole of area or place-based approaches could be really useful for us. There are some fantastic initiatives where data is being shared in repositories and allowing collaboration, and I'd love to see more of this. And I think we've really started on a great journey about speaking the language, same language, but that needs to be continued. James would absolutely, he's sitting on my shoulder saying, don't forget the equity focus. And I think we do need to take an equity focus in practice and training that's mindful of the unequal distribution of health and the sorts of barriers that some of our families may be experiencing. I think we need to be generating evidence that puts inequalities at the heart of the design of different types of studies, that involves representatives and participants to improve uptake and effectiveness. And I know there's some terrific work that's either happened or is happening in the planning stage in this country and also in Australia. It's going to be very important to move things forward. I think harnessing the power of service data to inform approaches is also going to be important to us, and advocating for equitable resource allocation and distribution. So in summary, we've come a long way. I think we're beginning to understand the needs of the population of children with developmental language disorders. We've certainly got a bigger grasp on the social and environmental determinants and the changing nature of communication disabilities in society. Just before James died, we were putting the finishing touches to a lifelong project for him, really, a book on that he edited called Language Development, Individual Differences in a Social Context. And I was really pleased and proud to see this culminate in this edition. It has global contributions. It draws together a series of new analyses of data related to children's language development. It was James's vision of where he thought we needed to be. And I hope many of you will have an opportunity to read it. In conclusion, I just want to add a few personal words about how much fun we had with James. He was not only a brilliant mind, but he was incredibly good fun to be with. And as Julie said, our conversations usually started with catching up about our families. His love of life was infectious, and his interest in people and thirst for knowledge about places was wonderful, but at times exhausting. He taught me much. He brought great joy, as these pictures depict, and he will forever be missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. That was a really great presentation and a really lovely ending to it. Thank you. I'd like to hand over now to Christina to talk about interventions. And please do post your questions for Sheena and Christina in the Q&A.
Thank you. Are people seeing the right screen there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, that was very moving. And as Sheena said, it's a real honour to have been invited to talk today by IJLCD in honour of James. Thank you. Okay, so thanks for that really fascinating overview, Sheena, and you've really set the scene for what I'm going to talk about next. So thank you for that. So I'm going to focus on intervention and describe how we're taking James's legacy forward with respect to the development and implementation of effective interventions for children with low language and DLD. Okay, excuse me a moment, it doesn't want to move forward. There we go. So clearly we're focused on James's work today, but in addition to his work, his legacy was also about people. So in this presentation, you'll see the work of several early career researchers, and here are just a few of them who and their future careers in shaping the field of child language research, policy and practice are also his legacy, as well as his scientific research. So just to set the scene then for this part of the talk, I want to remind us all why we should consider child language an issue of social justice and how James really helped us to understand this issue. So as Sheena clearly described, large-scale representative population cohorts provide really clear empirical evidence that all children don't learn language at exactly the same rate, and that these individual differences in children's language abilities and developmental trajectories are the product of this complex interplay between the child's biological endowment, their family, community, and the societal context within which they live, and how these interact in the moment for the child and over developmental time. So as Sheena also said, we also know that language follows a social gradient. And so there are inequalities in child language outcomes that are linked to the socioeconomic status of that child. And James was able to demonstrate that this was indeed a gradient and not a cliff edge where only those who are most deprived are disadvantaged, but rather that there's a gradual increase in language ability as families, decrease in average language ability, sorry, as families and children experience greater levels of disadvantage. He was able to demonstrate that this gradient existed across countries internationally. So here, looking at language in the UK, in Scotland and Australia, we saw this gradient associated with indices of multiple deprivation. And very recently, he completed some work looking at the association between maternal education and language outcomes, again in the UK and the Netherlands and in Germany. So the distribution of language difficulties across society, as Sheena suggested, is therefore unfair and requires us to view it through a lens of health inequalities and public health intervention approaches. James also saw child language as a key indicator, a canary in the coal mine, as it were, and a key indicator of societal inequalities and how they are playing out to affect children's life chances. So as we all know, children with low language abilities are at substantially increased risk of poor long-term outcomes with respect to social emotional well-being, literacy, mental health, employment outcomes, health literacy, social anxiety, and isolation. I say as we all know, but as we all know is because of the work that James Law completed. That's why this is now a given, and we all understand this issue for children's long-term life chances with low language abilities. These consequences that affect the individual through their life course then also affect the environment in which their own children grow up. And so child language difficulties can be seen as both a cause and a consequence of social disadvantage. So as well as an indicator of social inequalities, James saw it also as a key potential lever for change. If we could find ways to enable all children to develop robust language and communication development, if we could enable all children to achieve their maximum potential for learning language and communication, then might this be a lever for change? Could this be a mechanism through which children's long-term life chances could become more equal and perhaps break or ameliorate this intergenerational transmission of social disadvantage that I mentioned? Okay. So given that child language is an issue of social justice, then clearly it makes logical sense to develop and implement interventions which enable all children to achieve their maximum potential for language and communication development, and to develop interventions which can ameliorate some of those negative consequences for those who have persisting language difficulties. So the question then is, what's stopping us? If it's such a logical, clear conclusion, why is it difficult for us to deliver these interventions in the real world? So I've broken down, I think there are a number of key challenges which make this hard to do. And in this talk, I'm going to identify 4 key challenges which I think are crucial if we're going to be able to develop and deliver these interventions to enable all children to reach their potential. And for each of these challenges, what I'm going to do for each one is describe the challenge in a little bit more detail, so unpack what I mean by that challenge. And then I'm going to describe some of the ways that James was a pioneer in addressing these 4 challenges, so identify some of James's vital work in this space. And then for each one, also talk about how we're building on James's legacy and conducting new research in the field to tackle these 4 challenges. So as I say, the challenges are, for me anyway, I think the key challenges are intervention within the context of health inequalities, intervention in the context of life course approaches, intervention within complex systems, and intervention as the implementation of evidence into practice. So I'll tackle each of those ones in turn in the remainder of the talk. Okay, so challenge 1 relates to intervention within the context of health inequalities. So as Sheena has described already, not only do language abilities follow the social gradient, but also access to support and the ability to benefit from any support is also influenced by socioeconomic circumstances. So if done badly, public health interventions can therefore serve to widen rather than narrow inequalities. It's the reason that this widening can happen is because families living with social disadvantage are less likely to seek support than more advantaged families, less able to change behaviour due to a higher burden of material, and psychosocial vulnerabilities. So, for example, if a behaviour in an intervention is to increase parental book reading, that's much more difficult for families with higher burdens in terms of their material context and their psychosocial family context. Socially disadvantaged families are less able to navigate complex and fragmented services, and unfortunately I think that's how we would describe child language intervention services in many countries in the world, that they are complex and fragmented. And they're also less able to advocate for their child's rights to education and health services. And finally, and maybe most obviously, but actually perhaps becoming more and more important in the UK, they're less able to pay for private services to supplement those that are on offer from the state. Okay. So how did James pioneer work in this space then? So in response, and as Sheena described, James brought a focus on the upstream determinants of inequalities in child language across numerous papers and reports, ensuring that we didn't just focus on what was immediate in the child's context, but that we acknowledge the broader social and societal drivers of disadvantage in our design and development of interventions. James was also an early adopter of the term proportionate universalism from the work of Professor Michael Marmot, and to begin applying it to child language. So proportionate universalism entails refers to universal provision of services where the scale and intensity of service delivery is tailored to the individual's disadvantage and needs. So it's delivery of intervention to all, but changing the intensity of the support offered according to the needs, both in terms of the severity of the disorder and the risk, and also the surrounding contextual factors which can affect a family's ability to engage with or benefit from an intervention. The focus then is not on equality of provision, the focus is on providing interventions which evoke equal benefit for everybody. So as James noted in his 2018 paper focused on this work, how precisely proportionate universalism should be put into practice has not been well articulated. Indeed, if it's mishandled, the targeting of differing provision for different groups can serve to stigmatise those groups sometimes, and so potentially there's a risk of harm or of not reaching the groups that it aims to help the most. And so operationalising proportionate universalism in child language intervention remains a challenge. So now I'm going to present a project which builds on James's legacy, and this is the paper that goes with this project is called Making the Most of Together Time, and it's the development of a health visitor-led intervention to support children's early language and communication development at the 2 to 2.5-year-old review. So it's an aim, we're aiming in this intervention to develop and devise a proportionate universal language intervention. So I want to describe that piece of work now. Okay, so in 2019, just to give you some background to the work, the Department for Education and Public Health England commissioned research to create a national approach to support the development of children's early language. So this was called the Best Start in Speech, Language and Communication. And one strand of this work was focused on the universal review, the health visitors review at 2 to 2.5 years, where all families have contact with their health visiting team. And this was a project which James led, and it had 3 different strands to it. There was the development of an early identification measure, which James led that work with Jenna Charlton and Robert Rush and others in the team. There was a piece of work which looked at parents' perspective of considering language and communication needs at this 2 to 2.5-year review, with Sue Ralston and Caitlin Home leading most of that work. And then there was a 3rd strand, which I'm going to talk about now, which was the development of an intervention, which I led, but with obviously the input of the whole team there. And in this intervention development study, this intervention development strand of the work, our aim was to design an intervention which was acceptable, feasible and equitable, and that synthesised current best evidence with stakeholder views, and which could be delivered feasibly in the context of this health visitor to 2 to 2.5-year review. So just to talk you through the methods of the intervention design, because I think this is quite important and I'll return to it later. How we designed the intervention was that we designed it in close partnership with stakeholders across 5 sites in England, as indicated on the map here. The sites varied substantially in their geography and in the demographics of the population served. We used methods which maximise stakeholder co-design and involvement in the work, and we followed the latest guidance on intervention development methods. There's been a rapid increase in our methodological understanding of how to do this well, and we drew on that innovation. We conducted 13 workshops that involved 28 health visitors, members of health visiting teams, 8 SLTs and 7 parents and caregivers. Sorry, my slides are doing some funny things. I'll just click through. Many of the participants were involved in more than one workshop development process as well. So there were 13 workshops that we completed. And we also drew on a range of implementation science theory to support our work, to be informed by behaviour change theory and support its implementation. And I'll return to that in a moment. Okay, so the development process involved 5 stages. Each had a different activity happening at each stage, and each produced a different output. And the output fed through to inform the next stage into the intervention development process. So stage 1 was an evidence review, drawing on recent systematic reviews to identify effective interventions for children in this age group. And the output here at this stage was a broad logic model for our intervention, and also a set of papers to inform intervention design. Stage 2 involved extracting data from the papers and designing some co-design workshops to run with stakeholders. So the outputs here were, we identified the candidate target behaviours for the intervention from effective intervention studies. We identified the techniques that were used in the interventions in those effective studies. And then we also designed a set of persona which described different families living with a range of different social contextual factors that are known to influence language development. And these persona were important for our aim to design an equitable intervention. Our workshop materials were designed to look at what were the barriers and enablers to changes in behaviour, to engaging in the interventions for families living with these really widely varying social circumstances. The third stage was co-design workshops with parents and practitioners, and here we examined the acceptability of the techniques, the barriers and enablers for different families to the approaches that to the behaviours that we wanted to change. And in particular, attention was paid to diverse family circumstances and the range of barriers which might exist. Stage 4 then involved this work of mapping our findings to the theoretical frameworks from implementation science theoretical models to consider how the barriers and enablers that we identified could best be addressed through interventions. And at this stage, we developed a prototype intervention pathway and a prototype set of materials for the intervention. And the final stage was us going around humbly receiving feedback from our stakeholders about why what we were doing was terrible idea and how ideas needed to change. And we iteratively developed and changed the model of intervention over a series of co-design workshops until we had a final model that was acceptable and feasible to our stakeholders. So just to then briefly describe what the intervention looked like. So we found the behaviour which stakeholders told us was acceptable and feasible for us to target in the intervention was to create an intervention which would support families to increase their use of responsive interaction within their daily routines at home with their young child. And we found for the intervention to be equitable, it must be proportionate, as Marmot describes, with higher intensity for higher levels of disadvantage, so more resource for those living with higher levels of disadvantage, but not just in terms of intensity, also to be tailored to the different family circumstances, so offering differing approaches, considering the specific barriers and enablers, the specific assets and challenges in each family. And so I'm going to briefly talk you through a simplified model of the intervention pathway. On the slides, there's some references to more detail of the publications that go with this if people are interested in looking in more detail. But here's a simplified model of the pathway. So first of all, we use the measure which James developed called the ELIM, the Early Language Identification Measure, to identify those children who we think are most at risk. Then, if we think the intervention is needed, we consider the specific barriers and enablers which are in place for that specific family to being able to increase their use of responsive interaction with their child in their daily routines. We've used something called the COM-B model, which I know lots of people are becoming more and more familiar with, which looks at different types of barriers which might exist for a family. Capability barriers, opportunity barriers, and motivation barriers. So many interventions assume that it's a lack of skills or a lack of knowledge which are barriers for families. Here we're encouraging practitioners, health visitors to consider the motivational barriers, such as self-efficacy, for example, or self-confidence, and opportunity barriers such as available time, as well as capability barriers. So just to give you a sense, we've developed a tool to support this reflection for health visitors, which identifies some of the different types of barriers that might exist for families. So for example, a capability barrier might be a lack of skills in following a child's lead in play or sharing a book. Or it might be, for example, being able to decide on what they need to change to achieve their goal. A motivation barrier might be a lack of belief in their own abilities to make the change in their behaviour, or in feeling overwhelmed perhaps by additional demands of trying to make this change. And an opportunity barrier, might relate to access to books or toys, or to having a social network to draw on for support. So once the practitioner is asked to reflect on that and to have some discussions with the family about their specific context. And then what they do is they choose a responsive interaction behaviour that the parent might want to, the family decides that they want to try to do more often. So we use a shared decision-making tool to do that. So a set of cards where the family goes through the cards and decides which things they think they're doing a lot already, which things they might want to try to do more often. And they choose their one behaviour that they want to change. Then they choose the context within which they would like to practice the behaviour. So again, a shared decision-making tool where they find with the health visitor, what's the right together time for you and your family to work on responsive interaction. And then once they've done that shared goal setting together with the health visitor, then they go back to think about the COM-B tool to consider what's the intensity and the type of support that that individual family needs to benefit from the intervention. If a family has only a few capability barriers, then they may be able to take a self-directed approach with maybe written and online guidance materials as to how to achieve their goal, and with just maybe a telephone check-in with the health visitor to see how things are going. Whereas if a family has motivation barriers, then we're suggesting that they may need a coaching approach with more direct support from the health visitor or other services in their area. And if there are opportunity barriers, for example, to social support or physical resources, in addition to this coaching, we might offer support to access a playgroup, support to access a toy library, and so on. So that's our attempt at developing a proportionate universal intervention in that space. So now moving on to our second challenge then, intervention in the context of a life course approach. So as Sheena outlined, a life course perspective considers how risks accumulate and interact over a person's lifetime, with some risks starting chain reactions of risks, and also potentially leading to the intergenerational transmission of health inequalities. A life course perspective also highlights that as there are some periods in a life course when the child's development is more sensitive to certain exposures. So children may benefit more from enabling exposures at one point in their life, or be more disadvantaged by risks than at other times in the life course. Excuse me a moment, post-COVID cough. So this is a really useful framework, and I think now that we know that DLD is a lifelong condition, it becomes even more important to our thinking. But it also poses significant questions for us. When to intervene, on what, for how long, at what stages in a person's life course? Does early intervention have bigger effects than later, for example? Do the risk exposures change over the life course, and so our focus and interventions need to change? And if we want to prevent negative consequences into adulthood, Do we need to intervene into adolescence, into adulthood, over the life course? It leaves us with many, many questions still to answer. James's contribution here was obviously huge to thinking about language and the life course approach. He used multiple longitudinal cohorts to explore how to identify children early, to understand the mechanisms of cumulative and interacting risks over time, and to understand the long-term consequences for children and young people who have low language early in their lives. He was one of the first to explore links between language and mental health, and I've just listed just a small number of the papers that he published on these slides in this space. And as Julie Dockrell mentioned, the two papers which James published using the BCS 70 cohort, looking at outcomes at 34 years, have become seminal works in the field. This work with Ingrid Schooner, Robert Rush and Sarah Parsons, demonstrating the effects on literacy, mental health and employment at age 34 years, is now cited in almost every policy document that you can find about speech, language and communication needs in the UK and beyond, to motivate a life course perspective to child language. So now here's an example of work that we are conducting building on this legacy. And it's called Examining Patterns and Mechanisms of Inequality, Relations between Child Language and Adolescent Mental Health across subgroups of cumulative disadvantage. So the goal here is to consider whether early language intervention could prevent later mental health difficulties, and to what degree this is true for all children. And this is work that I've conducted with Jo Willoughby, one of James's PhD students. So we know that early language is associated with mental health into adolescence and adulthood. And this brings with it the possibility that early language interventions might prevent or at least ameliorate later mental health difficulties. And indeed, there's promising evidence to that effect. We also know that both language and mental health are affected by the socioeconomic circumstances of the child and the family. But what we wanted to unpack here in this research is to understand, is it also possible that the relationship between language and mental health outcomes might be affected by the socioeconomic circumstances of the child and family? So perhaps, is it that only in more advantaged families would children's mental health benefit from better language abilities, as perhaps for more disadvantaged families, other life stressors might override any possible benefits of having robust language development? So we wanted to understand whether that relationship between language and mental health differed depending on the socioeconomic circumstances of the family. As Sheena also mentioned, we know that risk factors hunt in packs. So particular socioeconomic circumstances and risk exposures tend to cluster together into subgroups. So for example, housing insecurity tends to cluster with parental mental health problems, let's say. Poverty tends to cluster with maternal education. So they don't all exert their influences separately, but can tend to cluster together. So what we did was we've analysed the Millennium cohort to identify subgroups in socioeconomic circumstances, and also to examine whether these subgroups moderate the effect of early language abilities on adolescent mental health outcomes. So we're asking the question, is language less protective of mental health outcomes for some subgroups in society, to help us to design what our preventative interventions might look like? Okay, so we found 7 subgroups in our work with gradually increasing numbers of risks. This graph has language at 3 years on the horizontal axis and externalizing mental health problems on the vertical axis, with a higher score meaning higher difficulties. Each line here is a different subgroup of risks, and the dotted line marks a cut point indicating clinical concern. So we found that the more risks the child experiences, the more likely they are to have mental health difficulties, unsurprisingly probably. We also found that for, we also found that for almost all the groups, the relationship between language and mental health was the same or very similar. So you'll be able to see that the slopes are very similar. So early language intervention could be protective for almost all groups. The exceptions were a group which included multilingual children, which I'm trying to get my pointer to work. It's this dark turquoise line, my pointer's not working, that looks flat, and the dark green line, which looks flat. Those were exceptions. For the multilingual group, we think that this can be explained by the language measure not being in a home language. So we wouldn't like to overinterpret that group too much, the finding here for that group. But for the group with the dark green line here, that also has a flat trajectory, this group was characterized by children with developmental concerns and families where there were parental mental health issues. Yeah, I'll come back to how we interpret that in a moment. The other important thing to notice here is this subgroup here, who are the overwhelmed subgroup, where even children with average language abilities were meeting the clinical cut point for having mental health concerns in adolescents. Okay, so how do we interpret those findings? So what we can conclude from this analysis are that children across almost all subgroups are similarly affected by their level of language ability. So robust language skills could be of almost universal benefit for supporting, for protecting adolescent mental health outcomes. What is also clear that language intervention would not be a panacea. The number and nature of other risks are equally as important as language and must be tackled in interventions. In that overwhelmed subgroup, average language abilities were associated with externalizing problems reaching clinical levels of concern. So clearly holistic support is needed for families experiencing the highest levels of risk. So even children with good language abilities will need support with their mental health. And the lack of relationship between language and mental health outcomes for that developmentally vulnerable low maternal resource subgroup, the dark green line that I was talking about, that flat line, meaning that these children will not necessarily benefit, have the protection of high language abilities for their adolescent mental health outcomes, points to the need for targeted different approach for that group, perhaps related to maternal mental health and wider family support. Okay, so now moving to our third challenge then to delivering interventions to support all children's language development. This is the challenge of intervention within complex systems. So this relates to the provision of intervention across these, across complex teams. So as we know, language learning takes place in all aspects of a child's daily life. It takes place from infancy to adulthood. And we also know that the necessary skills, knowledge, and capacity to support language development are distributed across the children's workforce and across the community. Services to support language development, therefore, must be able to cut across contextual boundaries, age-related boundaries, and must be able to leverage all of these skills and human capacity to benefit children's language outcomes. However, those of us who've worked in children's services provision know they're pretty complex ecology. They're made up of a mix of statutory and voluntary provision, funded through public, private, charitable organisations, and staffed by a mix of health, education, and social care professionals. Not only is there complexity in that regard, what we also find is that these ecologies of children's workforces are different in different geographical areas. And the precise nature of these ecologies have emerged through a complex interaction between the current and the historical policy of that area, the geography, the funding, even down to whether or not there's strong relationships between individuals at the heads of different services. And so being able to harness all of this in a sensible way to support children's language development is no easy task. So looking at James's pioneering work in this space in response to this challenge then about mobilising and connecting the children's workforce, I think again Julie alluded to this, that James was a pioneer in seeing the need for children's services across health, education, social care and the voluntary sector to join up to address child language needs. This work began in his work looking at what he called boundary disputes between local authorities and speech and language therapists working to support children with SEND. Those of us who are old enough to remember statementing processes will remember the controversy about whether it was a local authority's job or a health services job to support children's language development. And James was at the forefront of that work right at the beginning. As he began thinking more broadly about public health approaches, his thinking became even broader about that. And it moved to thinking about the promotion of child language needing to be everybody's business. Everybody in the children's workforce needed to think that promotion of child language was their responsibility. We also completed work together looking at optimal models for collaborative working across health, education and social care to meet the needs of children with SLCN, using a social capital lens in this work that we completed together. And most recently, as part of a European cost action, we examined and described the differences that existed in service configuration across more than 30 different countries and how this affected the support that children receive. The detail of that is in this book here. And very recently, since James's death, we were able to publish this paper from that work out of the cost action, which looked at how the nature of what children receive in their intervention across Europe is influenced by how the intervention services are funded, for example. So James again has made an enormous contribution to this space. So thinking about now building on James's legacy in addressing this challenge, just to give you one example now. So, well, two examples actually. So the work I previously described in the Making the Most of Together time aims to harness health visitor resource and use that in partnership with speech and language therapy services. So the approach aims to bring together SLTs and health visitors to address the need. Other approaches to addressing this include place-based approaches, like, for example, Stoke Speaks Out, Get Happy Talking, and so on, that many areas in the UK are using to try to draw together and harness the resources of the children's workforce. So these draw on multiple community resources to bring about change in children's language and communication development, but actually few have been rigorously evaluated. Recently, Pauline Frizzell led some work to evaluate an intervention called Happy Talk, which is in place in some areas in Ireland. And what Happy Talk does, it simultaneously addresses early childhood educators' abilities to provide language enriching environments for children and parents and caregivers' use of responsive contingent interaction. So it's a 12-session programme where the SLT supports both early educators and parents. And what we found was there were significant intervention effects in this study for comprehension and total language scores, with large to moderate effective effect sizes respectively. So this pilot effectiveness study demonstrated the benefits of drawing across more than one aspect of the child's broader environment to support their early language development. So I should have said this was preschool services, so children 3 to 4.5, that kind of age range. Okay, so finally, to talk about the last challenge then, the fourth challenge about intervention as the implementation of evidence. So the challenge of getting efficacy research into policy and into practice. So in our forthcoming book that Sheena mentioned, there are a number of reviews of current evidence in here, and it's clear that there's now robust evidence from randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental studies that there's much that can be done to promote language gains for children. There are many effective interventions described there. Efficacy studies show benefits for children from the age of 10 months to adolescence from interventions, from clinic-based, home-based, and from school-based interventions. However, what these reviews in the book also point up is the challenge of delivering this support at scale. There's still a gap between what we know and what we do. And there's still a challenge to think about how do we bridge that gap and get evidence-based interventions into practice quickly and in a way which is sustainable in the real world. So James was again a pioneer in his work conducting the first Cochrane systematic review in speech and language therapy. He was passionate about ensuring practice was influenced by the best and most rigorous available evidence. And to that end, I think as Julie mentioned again, as part of the Better Communication Research Programme, he worked with ICANN to create the What Works database resource, which allows practitioners and policymakers to find interventions with robust evidence regarding their efficacy. And I think this is a sort of mark of James's approach to being an academic, but an academic who had a focus on making a difference in the real world. At the outset of the pandemic, James, with Melanie Dornstauder and Jenna Charlton, conducted a rapid review of telepractice for children with SLCN to meet the urgent need to inform practice at one of the most challenging times for our profession and one of the most challenging times for children and young people with SLCN. So there are two ways then that we're building on James's legacy to address this issue of evidence implementation. One is new approaches to systematic review and evidence synthesis, and another one is conducting intervention research to enable its ready uptake to policy and practice. So designing our research with implementation in mind. So I'm going to very briefly just give you some examples of some of the work in this space before we wrap up. So in terms of new approaches to systematic review, so the first systematic reviews were really asking, does speech and language intervention work? But thanks to the huge increase in intervention research, we're now beginning to be able to interrogate the evidence to ask different kinds of questions, which are important to practitioners, service providers, and policymakers and families. So, for example, we're looking at dosage. We're looking at how much intervention is needed, how often do children need to be seen, and for how long. So in work led by Pauline Frizzell, we looked at studies which manipulate quantitative aspects of dosage whilst holding all other aspects of the intervention delivery contents constant to discover what was the optimal dosage. We've also conducted a systematic review looking at active ingredients of interventions, again led by Pauline, and we're looking at studies which directly pit one active ingredient of intervention against another active ingredient of intervention to see which brings the biggest benefits, the most bang for your buck in an intervention as well, to maximise the efficiency of the intervention. And also Josie Tulip in their PhD thesis, supervised by myself and James Law, has looked at whether or not there's evidence to understand whether all children benefit equally for interventions or whether some children benefit more or less, depending on their individual profile of comorbidities and language difficulties. and we'll just, I'll say, hunt those papers out, or we can talk about them in the questions. With all of these, we found that reporting was really not very good in our intervention studies. There was an issue with quality and consistency of reporting, which stopped us from doing as much evidence synthesis across studies as we would have liked to do in these reviews. And so in response to that, Pauline and I are leading an international consensus group to develop agreed reporting guidelines for intervention research for children with and at risk of DLD to support future systematic reviews and evidence syntheses as we move forward. And a final new model of systematic review that we're conducting as part of the Collaboration for Communication Network is we're doing a realist synthesis where we have asked parents what's most important to them in terms of working collaboratively with speech and language therapists, and we're using the views of the parents to drive the questions of the systematic review. And so we're going to be looking at evidence to try to see, does evidence exist which actually meets the priorities of families with DLD? And then, as I say, the last point then is about how we conduct intervention research in a way which enables its ready uptake to policy and practice. So designing our research with implementation in mind. And to address this, we're doing a number of things embedded in these studies here that we've already talked about. The making the most of together time, Happy Talk, and then a study we haven't mentioned called Lively, which we've just finished in Newcastle, which compares building early sentences therapy with the Derbyshire language scheme. So what we've been doing then to enable this research to be more readily applied to practice is in the ELIM and the making the most of together time work, we've used extensive stakeholder engagement and co-design. And we've synthesized theory and evidence with implementation science, which tells us how to create change in interventions. We've included process evaluations into trials. So in the Lively study, we've not just looked at outcomes, we've looked at how the interventions have been used in schools to try to learn from that some key information that will then enable us to advise people how best to implement it into practice. And in Happy Talk, we've used an effectiveness design where the intervention was not delivered by researchers, but was delivered by SLT services, enabling their more ready uptake into practice. And what Pauline also did, really importantly, and something that I think we need to put in all of our intervention research, is she's embedded economic evaluation into the study and to support commissioners of services to understand the costs and the benefits of the interventions that we deliver. So to conclude then, James's body of work has radically changed the landscape in policy and practice for the better, clearly, for child language. And it's laid the foundation for continued development and improvement. And to build on this legacy, I believe we need to focus on co-design, implementation science and economic evaluation in our intervention studies. We need to keep the focus on equity and introduce more of the voices of people with DLD and their families into our research. We need to work towards open science, international cooperation and consensus in intervention studies to enable us to synthesize all of that evidence that's coming through for the benefits of children and young people with DLD. And at a service level, I think we need to elevate public health roles in SLT, increase their status, increase their visibility, and make them a crucial part of what we do in our services. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Sheena, for such wonderful talks. We've got a little time now for questions, and they've been coming in. Joanne is going to read them out, I think, for Sheena and Christina to answer, and I think most questions have been marked for either one of you. Joanne, do you want to go with the first question?
Sure. So there is some questions in the Q&A and questions in the chat. I'm going to start with the questions that were in the chat, but as I'm kind of reading those ones out, if people have other questions, please post them in the Q&A so they're all in one place. Otherwise, we might miss some. So the first question I have that was posted in the chat is from Julie Morris, and she's asking, I'm interested in the point about phenotyping and characterising DLD. In the field I work in, which is acquired adult language disorders, there's been a great deal of international work on core outcome sets to be used in research studies. I would suggest there are pros and cons of this approach. Is this a direction of travel in DLD? So core outcome sets, what do you think? And I guess that's a question for both of you.
I'm happy to start, and Christina, jump in by all means. I think it's a really interesting question, and I agree there are pros and cons, because one can get so extremely narrow on a set of criteria that you might miss a whole load of important points. I guess my point was about the point that I was making was really about some of the historical data that has been used, particularly in some of the genetic studies that focused very much on the exclusion criteria that were once used around DLD. Now, if I speak to any of the geneticists doing this study, you know, they want the phenotype so well defined and sorted out, it would take us forever to be able to find sets of children to do that. I think the DLD consensus has brought us a considerable way in thinking about talking about the same problem rather than a variety of different ideas or concepts that we might individually have. But there's no doubt we're going to have to get to some point in the future where we do agree around how we define the problem and how we measure the problem. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to actually share data across data sets, and it becomes incredibly difficult to replicate findings across studies as well. So look, I don't think I've got an answer to what you're posing. I think we will have to approach this cautiously and not with a really stringent set of criteria, because we'll end up back where we were. But I think perhaps doing that for either clinical or you know, particular types of studies is quite important. But I think Sue Rolston's posed a question around it's just as important for clinical work as well. Christina, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to say that we're trying to convene an international, we are convening an international consensus group and about to publish a position paper, sort of call to arms to start thinking about consensus in reporting for DLD intervention research. I think it's really important, but I think there are huge challenges in it. So, for example, we're going to break it down into looking at what should we be reporting about participants if we're going to be able to answer those questions about, you know, do children with comorbidities respond equally to interventions to children without comorbidities, for example. Those sorts of questions, we need us all to be reporting the same information, but there are ethical issues and practical issues to doing that. So we want to talk to families with DLD to talk about the burden and ethicality of assessing everything about a child if we're going to be able to present that into intervention research. So I think there's a balance. I think us having an idea of what's core and what's additional and agreeing what's core for participant information, outcomes, and also the active ingredients of an intervention is where we would like to go. And I think it would bring substantial benefits, but won't be easy. Yeah.
Thank you. The other question in the chat was actually from Lindsay, but I will paraphrase for Lindsay in case she's forgotten what she asked, which is, Sheena, how do you think COVID provides a natural experiment on multiple risk factors? What an interesting question.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to answer that, Lindsay, at all, really. It's certainly driven some real inequities for the more disadvantaged families. And, you know, we've seen that across the world in a whole range of areas. And I think we're starting to see problems emerging in some of the children who were subject to stringent lockdowns in some cities, and not only in mental health, but there are also reports about their a number of developmental domains, including speech and language. So I think if you're referring to a cohort of kids who grew up with COVID versus a post-COVID cohort, yes, then I think there is a natural experiment. And we've thought about that a bit with our follow-up in ELVS, where the school leavers, just as we started, COVID hit and hit Melbourne, which had the most stringent lockdowns in Australia. So not only did we lose quite a lot of the cohort, but it's going to be very interesting to look at the reports from those high school leavers about their mental health and a range of issues. I'm assuming that's where you were going with that question.
That is what I was meaning. We were thinking yesterday, I was in a discussion for another project, and we were thinking about the children who, the very young children who have multiple risk factors, and we know that their development and their general development is delayed, and thinking about at what point does this tip over into something that is not going to get better? You know, that they're not going to catch up because their development has been so impacted by the social restrictions arising from COVID. Some will catch up and some won't. And who is it? So it speaks to your multiple risk factors that you were talking about. And I think it also, you know, that in some countries we'll be able to look at that better than others because we have better data about children in some countries than others. So whether we could begin to look at this and add to your data for children with delayed language development or developmental language disorder, I think would be really interesting. But whether we can do it in the UK is a different point.
I think it's a really interesting issue. Well, we can talk some more about that.
Lindsay, did you want me to read out the questions in the Q&A, or did you want to do that? You're on mute, but I think you're saying I can do it. Lip reading. This is a question from Helen Stringer. It's for Sheena as well. There is questions for you as well, Christina. Do we know how much under-identification of DLD is related to the early identification agenda that most countries have, so that we miss children who manage at the edge of early development and are not picked up, but really struggle as they have to deal with more complex language? Great question.
Look, it is a great question. And I don't know how well I can answer it, but I'll have a go and jump in, Christina, with any observations you have. I think the first thing to say is that community and population health studies use less stringent criteria to determine who has low language. I'm going to use that term for now. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. But even if we took into account the children who were really scoring most poorly in some of those community and population studies, we still find quite a major discrepancy in terms of who gets to clinic. And I think Carla McGregor has drawn that out from Bruce Tomblin's study. It comes out from Courtney's scales. We certainly can demonstrate it in ELVS as well. So there's something really interesting happening here that is a real phenomenon, even in the children that are scoring most poorly. So that deals with the sort of less stringent cut points that we might use. I do think that there's something about the way we're identifying children and the way some of these services are structured, and these differ across our countries. You know, there's not one size fits all. And even within the country, you can find multiple ways of doing this. So some areas are using a more stringent approach. And for me, it just speaks to that surveillance approach that we need, that this is not, you know, a one-off, see who we can identify and then, okay, we've done that. Because those early years, children are moving around, and some of them are right at the boundaries of some of those trajectories as well, in terms of moving in and out of more at-risk trajectories. And I think we've got to get a lot more sophisticated about who we're looking at over what period of time. So we may not be helping with those children that are around the margins. So I think that surveillance approach, the accumulation of the risks and the way those risks cluster are going to be very important. We don't need a new system. We can do all of this within what we've already got, but we probably need to do it differently than how we're doing it. Christina, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just I think if we start talking about a life course approach to DLD, I think that might be a helpful thing, so that you do meet teachers who say, oh, well, they were all right in the early years, so they haven't got any problems now. So getting people to understand that language difficulties can A, emerge later for children, and B, that a child's functioning is a interaction between their own language abilities and also the context within which they are interacting and communicating with others. So as the child moves through school, we need to keep revisiting any children who have a level of vulnerability to see how are they doing now, and considering what does that child need to support them at that particular stage in the life course. And I think we need to be asking ourselves about that into adolescence, and as children and young people with these sorts of vulnerabilities are moving out of school and into positions where there isn't any service provision for them at all. And then at a much more basic level, I think there is some sort of concrete risk factors about which children might have these more late emerging trajectories, and they are linked often to family history of literacy difficulties, for example, and also emerging other comorbid difficulties linked to social, emotional and mental health. So if we're looking at who some of these children are who might look like they're doing okay, but then get worse over time, those risk factors of family history and social, emotional and mental health might be some really practical things that people could look at for that subgroup.
Can I just add one thing to that? It's really interesting. In preparation for this, I went back and looked at all the studies that had examined this. Now, Bruce Tomblin's work first raised this possibility back in 1997, and it doesn't seem like we've made any progress. And we've got that data from the UK, we've got that data now from Australia and from the US, and it's really something you know, as a call to action that I think as a profession, we're going to have to think much harder about and get more sophisticated about.
Thanks, Sheena. I'm aware that Julie is going to close the session for us, so I'm going to ask one more question really briefly, but I encourage Sheena and Christina to type some of the answers to the questions while Julie's speaking. So this is the last question. Christina, briefly. You said that services are fragmented and complex, but rather than putting the focus on families for lack of engagement, how do we move forwards in the context of cumulative funding cuts? I'm aware that's a massive question, but I've asked you to answer briefly.
Oh, blimey, $1 million question. I think it is about, so in the UK, we are moving towards integrated care systems and integrated commissioning across health, education and social care. And I think we should be finding out in our local areas who's the head of our integrated care systems and services that are going to be running children's services as we move forward over the next coming years. And we need to go and talk to them about SLCN and say to them, this is one of the most complex public health issues where the resources required to support these children and families are fragmented, scattered and complex. How do we work together? The aim of these integrated care systems is to make those boundaries porous, and to create services which work around the child and the family. And I think we need place-based, locally based services that are about individual communities and how do we best meet the needs of those individual communities given the service provision that we have in those communities. So we need to talk to commissioners, we need to understand our local data, and we need to talk to those commissioners about how we bring services together to meet the local population need. And we need SLTs who are called public health SLTs in services to fly the flag for public health approaches and understand their local data.
Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time to read out all the wonderful comments in the chat for about James. Could I ask RCSLT to maybe pass them on to James's family who are not here today, because they won't get a chance to read them just from the recordings. That would be really lovely if we could pass them on to James's family as well. Lindsay, are we just going to hand over to Julie now? Is that right?
I can unmute myself. Yes, we're going to hand over to Julie just to close the session. And I'd like to say a really deep thanks to Christina, Sheena and Julie for their contributions today. It's been really fantastic to hear about James's work, some of which I wasn't aware of, and his impact on the speech and language therapy profession and research in the area. So thank you very much for doing that. We'll hand over to Julie to close the session. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. I'm going to be brief as we come to the end of this superb morning, and what a pleasure to be part of such a thought-provoking event, thought-provoking for me in different ways, in ways around James and in ways around the research in child language, and actually deep excitement about what I hear today, deep excitement. I might switch camps and move to child language, who knows. As we've reflected previously, James's work leaves that important legacy, that legacy on research in child language for researchers, for clinicians, for his students, and I think for the lives and life chances of children and their families. The slide, if we could shift on to the next slide, if that's possible, Rebecca. The slide, if it appears, just shows a small sample of some of James's work. I've picked some of the publications. And I think what those illustrate are how James's work reached different groups and was with different groups. His work aimed to speak and to influence researchers, clinicians, and importantly, policymakers. And that speaks to some of the things that Sheena and Christina have been speaking about. It brought people together who might not have worked together otherwise in different kind of ways. And it really considered those incredibly important questions and drove the field forward. I think the presentations we've heard today speak to directions for the future that build from James's work and from the researchers he's worked with, the many, many researchers he's worked with. It remains for me to offer thanks. Thanks to the editors and to Royal College for the organisation of today's event. To our superb colleagues, so echoing Lindsay, to Julie and to Sheena and Christina, for those thought-provoking presentations, to use the audience for your questions, which I think have furthered that thinking and that stimulation. It's lovely that James's family, I want to thank James's family for joining us today as well. It's lovely to have you with us. And not least to James himself, for all his contributions, for his generosity, his curiosity, his support and his humour. And I think that's a nice way to end the session. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you.